There is something most people misunderstand when they first encounter a deeply sensitive person, especially early in life. And the mistake is almost always the same. They assume what they are seeing is weakness, as if the ability to feel more, notice more, and react more deeply must mean a lack of strength, when in reality, it often signals the beginning of a very different kind of intelligence forming beneath the surface. One that does not look impressive at first because it is not loud, not dominant, not immediately useful in environments that reward detachment over awareness. From the outside, it is easy to misread the empath as fragile, someone who trusts too quickly, absorbs too much, and seems to break more often than others. But that interpretation says more about the observer than the person being observed, because most people are only measuring behavior, not understanding the conditions that created it. If you look closely, and more importantly, if you look long enough, a different pattern begins to reveal itself. Many of these individuals did not grow up in emotional ease. They grew up in environments where tension was unpredictable, where moods shifted without warning, where reading the room was not a social skill but a survival requirement. And over time, they learned to detect subtle changes, long before they could explain what they were noticing. Scanning tone, posture, silence, contradiction, all of it becoming data. Their mind processed continuously, quietly, without permission or pause. I have seen this pattern repeat in different forms, across different lives, and it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. But internally, it is relentless, because when a person learns early that emotional signals matter, they do not simply feel them, they study them, and that study does something unusual to the way they develop. What most people call being too sensitive is often the early stage of pattern recognition, but because it has not yet been refined, it appears chaotic, overwhelming, even self-defeating. The child, who notices everything but cannot yet organize it, becomes the adolescent who feels everything but doubts their own perception, and this is where the misunderstanding deepens, because others see confusion and assume incapacity, when in reality, it is unstructured awareness searching for coherence. Pain plays a critical role here, though not in the way people usually think. Most people assume pain simply damages, but in certain personalities, especially those who refuse to shut down emotionally, pain forces questions that others avoid for years. Questions about trust, intention, authenticity, and the gap between what people say and what they actually mean. And the empath does not ask these questions casually. They live inside them, turning them over repeatedly, testing them against real interactions, refining their understanding through experience rather than theory. That process is not comfortable, and it does not produce immediate strength, but it does something more important over time. It builds perception, and perception, once developed, becomes a form of power that is rarely recognized in its early stages because it does not announce itself. It looks like hesitation before it looks like clarity, like overthinking before. It looks like precision, like vulnerability before it becomes discernment. If you have ever watched someone like this closely, you may have noticed how often they pause before responding, how often they seem to be processing more than the situation appears to require, and it is tempting to interpret that as insecurity. But what if it is something else entirely? What if it is the mind learning to map human behavior in real time, collecting patterns that will later allow them to see what others miss, almost instantly? The difficulty is that during this formative stage, they do not yet trust what they see. And because they do not trust it, they remain exposed to it, absorbing more than they should, questioning more than necessary, staying longer than is healthy, all while being told, directly or indirectly, that the problem is their sensitivity rather than the environment shaping it. And so they begin to internalize the idea that something is wrong with them, when in reality something is being built within them, slowly, quietly, under pressure, that most people never have to navigate so early. So before you label that sensitivity as weakness, it is worth asking a different question, one that most people never consider. If someone learned to read emotional reality this deeply, this early, what exactly were they being trained for? And what might that ability become once it is no longer driven by survival, but guided by awareness? There is a stage in the empath's life that almost always looks like virtue from the outside and feels like purpose from the inside. And that is precisely why it becomes so dangerous, because what is actually happening is rarely recognized in real time. They begin to believe that their ability to understand others is not just a trait, but a responsibility, that if they can feel someone's pain, they are somehow meant to carry it, interpret it, soften it, and maybe even fix it. And this belief does not arrive as a conscious decision, but as a quiet assumption built over years of reinforcement. When you spend enough time being the one who notices what others ignore, you start to feel accountable for what you see, and over time, that accountability turns into obligation, and that obligation reshapes the way you relate to people in ways that are subtle at first and then increasingly costly. I have watched this pattern unfold more times than most people would find comfortable to admit, and it almost always follows the same progression. The empath enters a dynamic where something feels off, but instead of stepping back, they lean in, asking more questions, offering more patience, extending more understanding, because they believe that clarity and compassion can resolve what is actually rooted in something much deeper than misunderstanding. They begin explaining themselves to people who are not confused but committed to misinterpreting. They give time to those who consistently take without reflection. They remain emotionally available in situations where their presence is not valued but simply expected. And all the while, they interpret their own exhaustion as a sign that they need to try harder, rather than a signal that something is fundamentally misaligned. The problem is not that they care too much, it is that they confuse caring with responsibility. And once that confusion takes hold, there is almost no natural stopping point. Because if your role is to understand, then every failure becomes something to analyze rather than something to leave. Every boundary feels like a betrayal of your own identity. And every act of self-protection feels like a form of guilt. This is where the internal conflict becomes severe, because part of them begins to notice the imbalance, the lack of reciprocity, the subtle erosion of their own sense of self, but another part insists on maintaining the narrative that patience and empathy will eventually create change. And so they stay, not because they are blind, but because they are interpreting what they see through a framework that rewards endurance over clarity. What makes this even more complex is how others respond to this dynamic, because when someone is consistently available, consistently forgiving, consistently willing to absorb discomfort without consequence, people adapt to that, and not always consciously, but effectively. They learn that access requires no accountability, that apologies do not need to lead to change, that inconsistency will be tolerated as long as it is explained convincingly enough. And this is where something critical shifts, because the empath is no longer just participating in dysfunction, they are sustaining it. not out of weakness, but out of a misplaced sense of duty that was never meant to operate without limits. Emotional overextension does not simply drain energy, it distorts perception. It creates a kind of internal noise where intuition becomes harder to trust because it is constantly overridden by justification. And over time, this leads to a quiet form of self-abandonment that is difficult to detect because it feels like loyalty. But loyalty to what exactly? And at what cost? If you observe closely, you will notice that the empath in this stage is often surrounded by people who benefit from their consistency but do not match it, who rely on their understanding but do not offer it, who expect their presence but do not protect it. And yet the empath continues, believing that withdrawing would make them less of who they are, when in reality, the opposite is true, because compassion without discernment does not create connection, it creates imbalance. And imbalance, sustained long enough, becomes self-destruction in slow motion, not dramatic, not obvious, but cumulative, eroding clarity, weakening boundaries, and teaching others that there is no cost to crossing them. They thought they were preserving connection. They thought they were choosing kindness. But in reality, they were abandoning themselves one moment at a time. And there is a difference between being compassionate and being available for harm. There comes a point, often after a period of exhaustion that can no longer be explained away as stress or miscommunication, when something begins to reorganize inside the empath. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a quiet clarity that feels different from everything that came before. Because, for the first time, they stop asking how to fix what they are feeling and start asking whether what they are feeling is accurate. That shift may sound subtle, but psychologically, it changes everything. Because it marks the moment when sensitivity begins to move out of reaction and into interpretation. And interpretation is where power begins to form. Up to this point, they have been absorbing emotional signals without filters, feeling tension without naming it, sensing contradiction without trusting it, noticing patterns but constantly overriding them with explanations that preserve connection at the expense of clarity. And this creates a kind of internal conflict where intuition is active but unsupported, always present but rarely obeyed. I have seen this moment arrive in people in ways that are almost unnoticeable to others, but unmistakable if you know what to look for, because instead of leaning further into confusion, they begin to step back, not to disconnect, but to observe, and observation changes the relationship entirely. They start paying attention not just to what people say, but to what remains consistent over time, not just to emotional expression, but to behavior under pressure, not just to isolated moments, but to patterns that repeat despite apologies, explanations, or temporary improvements. And once you begin seeing patterns, something becomes difficult to ignore. Human behavior is far more predictable than most people realize, especially when you stop focusing on presentation and start focusing on consistency. What once felt overwhelming begins to organize itself into signals, and those signals begin forming conclusions that no longer require constant reevaluation. Because the empath starts recognizing that clarity does not come from giving people endless opportunities to explain themselves, but from watching what they consistently do when it matters. This is where discernment emerges, not as suspicion, not as cynicism, but as calibrated perception, the ability to distinguish between what appears sincere and what actually holds integrity over time. And this distinction is not abstract. It shows up in very real ways. The difference between someone who offers warmth and someone who offers reliability, between someone who apologizes and someone who changes, between someone who seeks understanding and someone who uses vulnerability as a tool to maintain access. Most people miss these differences because they are focused on surface signals, but the empath, who has been shaped by experience, begins to register the underlying structure of behavior almost immediately. And that changes how they respond. Instead of over-explaining, they become selective with their words. Instead of reacting to every emotional shift, they begin to wait, to watch, to confirm. And this creates a kind of internal steadiness that was not available before, because their perception is no longer competing with their desire to maintain connection. There is a moment, and it is often quiet, where they realize they no longer need to convince anyone of what they see, and this may be one of the most significant psychological thresholds they cross. Because the need to be understood begins to loosen its grip, and in its place comes something far more stable: self-trust. Once that happens, the entire dynamic of interaction shifts. Because manipulation depends on confusion, it depends on self-doubt. It depends on the ability to redirect attention away from patterns and toward isolated explanations. But when someone sees patterns clearly and trusts what they see, those tactics lose effectiveness almost immediately. This is why people who relied on the empath's earlier openness often react when this shift occurs. Because the script changes, the predictability disappears, and what used to be easy access becomes conditional, not through force, but through awareness. The empath does not need to become aggressive. They do not need to withdraw completely. They simply stop participating in interpretations that contradict observable reality. And that alone is enough to alter outcomes. What looks like distance from the outside is often precision on the inside. A deliberate alignment between perception and response that was not possible before. At some point, feeling stops being the problem, and not understanding what you feel becomes the real danger. Because once perception becomes clear, very little needs to be explained, and even less can be used against you. For a long time, the empath does not experience their life as a process of becoming, but as a process of adjusting, constantly calibrating who they are in response to who they are with. And this adjustment is so gradual, so normalized, that it rarely feels like a loss at first. It feels like intelligence, like social awareness, like knowing how to keep things smooth, how to avoid unnecessary conflict, how to remain acceptable in environments where being fully seen has never felt entirely safe. They learn to soften their tone when truth might create tension, to filter their perceptions when those perceptions challenge someone else's narrative, to reduce the intensity of what they feel so others are not made uncomfortable by it. And over time, this becomes less of a strategy and more of an identity, a quiet belief that who they are must be moderated to be maintained. I have seen people operate like this for years without realizing the cost, because externally, everything appears functional, relationships continue, conversations flow, nothing seems dramatically broken. But internally, something begins to fragment, because there is a difference between choosing your words and editing your existence. And the empath, without noticing, when the line was crossed, often moves from one into the other. This is where self-reduction takes hold, not as a single decision, but as a pattern repeated across countless small moments, moments where they say less than they know, accept more than they should, stay longer than they want, and reinterpret their own discomfort as something to manage rather than something to respect. The psychological weight of this does not always surface immediately, but it accumulates, and eventually it creates a kind of internal tension that cannot be ignored. A sense that something essential is being compromised in exchange for stability that never fully arrives. The turning point rarely comes from a single dramatic event. It emerges from accumulation, from the realization that no matter how carefully they adjust, the outcome remains the same. The same misunderstandings, the same imbalances, the same quiet dissatisfaction that cannot be explained away by effort. And when that realization becomes undeniable, something begins to shift. Not outwardly at first, but internally, where a different question starts to replace all the previous ones. Instead of asking how to be better for others, they begin asking what it is costing them to continue like this. And that question is not easy to sit with, because it forces a confrontation with choices that were made in the name of connection but resulted in disconnection from self. There is a moment, and it is often quieter than expected, when the empath recognizes that the version of themselves they have been maintaining is not false, but incomplete, shaped by adaptation rather than alignment. And once that recognition takes hold, it becomes increasingly difficult to continue operating in the same way. This is where self-possession begins, not as a declaration, but as a refusal to continue translating their reality into something more acceptable at the expense of its accuracy, a refusal to shrink insight into politeness when clarity is required, a refusal to participate in dynamics that demand their silence in exchange for belonging. What changes here is not their capacity for empathy, but their relationship to it, because empathy is no longer used to override their own experience. It is used alongside it, creating a balance that did not exist before. They begin to notice how often they have been present in conversations where they were not actually heard, how often they have offered understanding without receiving it, how often they have been valued for their adaptability rather than their authenticity. And these observations are not dramatic, but they are precise. And precision creates a kind of internal stability that does not depend on external agreement. Others may interpret this shift as distance, as change, as a loss of warmth. But what is actually happening is far more grounded than that. It is the integration of perception and identity, where what they see and who they are begin to align without constant negotiation. There is less explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer feel the need to justify what is already clear to them, and this alters the dynamic in ways that are difficult to reverse. Because once someone stops reducing themselves to maintain connection, the nature of that connection is forced to reveal itself. For a long time, they survive by becoming smaller, quieter, more acceptable, but survival has a cost, and eventually the cost of disappearing becomes greater than the risk of being seen. There is a final shift that does not arrive with intensity or drama, but with a kind of quiet finality, the kind that does not ask for attention because it no longer depends on it. And this is where the empath stops trying to resolve the tension between who they are and how they are received, and begins to live without dividing those two realities anymore. For most of their life, there has been a gap between inner knowing and outer expression, a constant translation process where truth is softened, delayed, or reshaped to preserve connection. And that gap requires energy, not just emotional energy, but cognitive energy, because it demands continuous monitoring, continuous adjustment. continuous awareness of how one is being perceived and how much of oneself can be safely revealed. What many people never fully recognize is how exhausting it is to live like that. To be accurate internally but edited externally. To feel clearly but express selectively. To know what is true and still hesitate to stand inside it without modification. Over time, that division creates a subtle form of fragmentation, not visible to others, but deeply felt within. A sense that life is being managed rather than lived, and eventually, often, after enough experience has stripped away the illusion that approval can be stabilized through self-adjustment, something consolidates. The empath no longer negotiates their perception to maintain access to others, and this is not a rejection of connection. It is a redefinition of it, because connection that requires distortion is no longer perceived as connection at all. I have seen this moment emerge in people who have spent years adapting, and what is striking is not how much they change, but how little they need to change once they stop abandoning themselves. The intensity they once tried to reduce becomes coherence, the perception they once questioned becomes orientation, and the empathy they once extended indiscriminately becomes intentional, directed toward what is real rather than what is merely presented. This is where integration occurs, where the internal and external begin to align without constant effort. And that alignment creates something that is often misinterpreted by those who are still operating through approval or performance. It can look like distance, like detachment, like indifference. But it is none of those things. It is clarity without apology, presence without negotiation, a state where the empath is no longer trying to be understood by everyone because they no longer require universal agreement to trust their own perception. This is what inner sovereignty actually looks like in practice. Not control over others, but independence from the need to control how one is seen, because once that need dissolves, so do many of the mechanisms that once created vulnerability to manipulation. Guilt loses its leverage when self-respect becomes non-negotiable. Confusion loses its influence when patterns are no longer ignored. And external pressure loses its impact when internal alignment is stable. There is a noticeable shift in how they move through interactions. Less urgency, less over-explanation, less investment in outcomes that require them to compromise their clarity, and more consistency in how they choose where to place their attention, their time, their emotional presence, and that consistency is what changes everything, because it is no longer reactive, it is deliberate. And deliberate living produces a kind of stability that does not fluctuate based on external approval or rejection. What once felt like sensitivity now operates as a calibrated system of perception and response, not shutting down feeling, but directing it with precision, allowing them to engage deeply where it is warranted and withdraw cleanly where it is not, without internal conflict or prolonged justification. At this stage, they are no longer organizing their identity around what wounded them. They are organizing it around what they recognize as true. And that shift releases a tremendous amount of energy that was previously tied up in managing pain, managing perception, managing acceptance. They become more present, not because life has become simpler, but because their internal landscape is no longer divided against itself. And when a person is no longer divided, their presence carries a kind of weight that does not need to be asserted. It is simply felt, because there is no contradiction between what they perceive, what they value, and how they act. In the end, nothing essential about them needed to be removed. Nothing needed to be silenced. Nothing needed to be hidden. What changed was not who they were, but the moment they stopped walking away from it